these rules were to be implemented as final, then I do think the consequences could be dire. This seems to be an issue that everyone can agree on. Nobody likes this rule.
Monetizing clean energy tax credits is already tough enough. Critical to clean energy deployment, tax equity financing is both inefficient and undersupplied, and it could get a lot worse. A rule proposed by banking authorities could have big impacts on the few remaining tax equity financiers by upending how they weight project risk. Simply put, the rule would quadruple capital requirements for banks holding tax equity investments. I'm John Engel, editor-in-chief of Renewable Energy World. And this week on Factor This, I'm joined by Hilary Lefko, a partner at the Norton Rose Fulbright law firm. Lefko shares why the so-called Basel III ruling could lead to, in her words, dire consequences for the tax equity market and clean energy goals. Can it be stopped? That's all next on Factor This. Hilary Lefko, thanks so much for joining the Factor This podcast. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one, and it'll be a little bit newsier than some of our other episodes that'll take on a big topic or feature a executive that is embarking on a certain journey. This is a near and medium term issue that I think a lot of our audience, especially on the developer asset owner side, are going to be really interested in, especially since it involves the potential for a changing framework in tax equity, which we know from previous conversations and interviews that we've done on the show is already a difficult process and the bane of many existences in our clean energy space. So happy to dig into all of this with you and really break down, what's happening in the regulatory realm. Can you start us off with a little bit about your background and sort of your positioning on this, Hilary?
Sure. My name is Hilary Lefko, and I am a tax partner at Norton Rose Fulbright. Do a lot of representation of developers, investors, lenders, in all aspects of project finance, focused primarily on tax. Prior to joining Norton Rose Fulbright, my practice was almost exclusively representing tax equity investors. So I have a long history with tax equity and with financing of renewables, with solar, and with some of the monetization structures out there for financing tax credits.
So you've been on both sides of the fence then. You've worked for the tax equity investors, financiers, as well as the people seeking out those deals.
Exactly.
I'm sure that's advantageous for you as we're kind of going through this exercise of why is it so painful today?
It is. And I will say this is one of the few issues I've ever encountered in my career that everyone, no matter what side they're on, has this, takes the same position and wants the same outcome. So it's one of those rare issues that we can all agree on in the industry.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think that I hear the gripes, obviously, from the people I talk to every day, which are more developer asset owners. I don't hear as much from the tax equity space just because that's not my core competency, but it's also a little bit more buttoned up over there. Just bankers in general like to kind of keep things close to the vest. So maybe you'll be able to sprinkle in some of that insight too on what you're hearing from the other side. But can you set the stage for us a little bit and maybe add some color to the state of the tax equity market right now? We know that, it's incredibly important to this industry. It's a fundamental piece in how we deploy clean energy. But we have these, macroeconomic headwinds that are plaguing, seemingly every piece of the clean energy value chain right now. What does it look like?
Yeah, so I think that the tax equity market looks as robust as it always has been. I think the big banks are bullish. I think they see their role expanding. What's interesting is that the whole point of the IRA was Congress wanted to expand financing of renewables to more than just traditional tax equity, more than the big banks. I think, we've all heard the statistics that two banks absolutely dominate the tax equity market. They have, more than half of the $22 billion that was done in tax equity last year. And Congress saw that and wanted to open up financing to smaller projects, smaller developers that the traditional tax equity investors, weren't looking at. So I think, initially there was some concern that, the IRA with things like transferability, was going to completely pull the rug out from under the tax equity market. And that's just not the case. Talking to tax equity investors, while some of them are interested in buying tax credits and some have been buying tax credits, a lot of them have said that, that's not really how they want to make their returns. And you can't really compare tax equity and transferability, one-to-one, apples to oranges. That tax equity and those structures, getting depreciation, getting losses, that's what really drives the returns they're looking for. So they're going to continue to do the volume that they've always been doing of tax equity. They may be adding some transferability. And, most of the tax equity investors that I've talked to have said what they're really interested in is hybrid structures.
You mentioned, you started off by saying robust tax equity market. From the people I engage with every day, who are likely different than your individual clients or the people you're facing in the finance world, all I hear about is that the supply is incredibly constrained. You mentioned two big banks being the primary tax equity investors, and that the supply of tax equity interest has not scaled with the demand from the project and development side. So help me square that a little bit. Am I maybe hearing a bit of hyperbole, or is there some truth to that?
I think both are true. I think those traditional tax equity investors are going to continue to do their tax equity. They're going to continue to do their volume, if not more. I think some other banks will step in and continue to do tax equity. A few of the large corporates continue to do it. But I think that, the IRA grew the pie. It provided other opportunities for new types of renewables. We're not just talking about traditional wind, solar. There's lots of technologies out there now looking for financing. And I think that's, transferability is a huge key to that, direct pay. Also another big piece of that I think a lot of these newer technologies, smaller projects are going to have to look to other avenues, because you're right. The large institutional tax equity just isn't going to be there to finance those projects. But I think both are true. I think the banks are going to go gangbusters. And I also think that the smaller projects are going to have to look to something other than those banks.
So the reason we're talking today is you and your colleague at the firm, David Burton, wrote a really incredible in-depth breakdown of these proposed changes to banking rules and the potential impact to clean energy deployment. And in your words, yours and David's, you called the consequences potentially dire to the industry and even, tax equity markets. What is going on? Let's just start with what's going on. Help me set the stage here.
Well, I guess getting beyond our clickbait headline.
Oh, I already wrote that one. And those are your words. So the second I read dire, I knew that was going to go in the headline for this episode. And I didn't even share that with you. So that's very astute.
We have to drive up our blog traffic somehow.
That's right. That's right. SEO.
Yeah. So I think, if these rules were to be implemented as final, then I do think the consequences could be dire. I think we do have to look at it in the context of, when this first came out, we had no idea. None of us are, bank regulatory experts. We're not used to dealing with, the bank regulators. We don't know how they think. We don't know if they just put out an original rule and then rubber stamp it to the final rule. So I think at first this looked a lot more catastrophic than it might be. I think, the entire industry, and we talked about this at the outset of the call, this seems to be an issue that everyone can agree on. Nobody likes this rule. Everybody wants it scaled back. And I think the conversations we've heard from people that have had conversations with the government, it looks like there's a good chance that this rule is going to get relaxed in a way that's favorable to traditional tax equity financing.
Help us pull back a little bit. From a 30,000 foot perspective, what exactly is being considered by who? And how is this all shaking out? Can you do that kind of level setting for me?
Sure. And I'll explain this in plain English because I'm definitely not a bank regulatory expert. So basically, what the Basel rules are is they're a set of framework for central banks and bank regulators that certain member countries have agreed to implement. The last set of those rules, known as the Basel Endgame, because they're the final set of rules and because they're very comprehensive, was passed in response to financial crises that occurred 5, 6, 7 years ago. But it's taken this long for the U.S. to get together and get out a set of regulations implementing it. So our bank regulatory and central bank agencies have gotten together. So the Fed, and put out this set of rules that addresses, among other things, how to implement Basel III. And one of the things contained in those rules, and this is, 1,200 pages of rules, and we're talking about, about a half a page. One of the things buried in all of those rules is this idea of capital weighting and how certain investments are treated for purposes of how banks have to maintain their capital reserves. So previously, under prior rules, tax equity had 100% weight. Now it has a 400% weight. So the amount of capital that a bank has to reserve when it makes a tax equity investment would quadruple under these rules. And these rules wouldn't take effect until 2025.
So how impactful could that be to the market? Like, what's been the general reaction to that proposal that you've heard?
Well, it's a problem. Banks do not want to have to increase their capital holding requirements. It would make these projects generally uneconomic. The terms that banks would need to be able to do this would just make the pricing completely out of reach for sponsors. So I think, if this were to be implemented, it could be catastrophic. It could put an end to the big banks doing a large amount of tax equity. I think we would see the market shrink, considerably if these rules became final.
And without an unprecedented action by corporates to step in and fill that void, which doesn't seem to be the likely scenario, then the industry, in general is in a really, really sticky spot because it's fueled by tax equity. Without tax equity,
Right.
None of this happens.
Right. Well, and, transferability is great, but, with transferability, you're only monetizing the tax credits, and you're generally getting less on the dollar than you would for traditional tax equity because you lose that depreciation monetization.
Then I don't think it's hyperbole. We joked a little bit about, the clickbaity headline. If that's the potential impact, I do think it's worthwhile to say, here's a proposal out there that a bunch of smart people have put into a very dense and thoughtful document. So it does not come out of nowhere. But what does this say about the banking industries, or at least the regulators' view of the riskiness of clean energy project development squared with the riskiness of something else like equity markets or mortgages, for example?
Yeah, so I think it's unfortunate that tax equity is being swept into the category it's being swept into. And I don't think it was intentional. And I think the conversations that we've heard that people have had with the government, it seems that they were not intending to say that tax equity is inherently this risky. It's kind of a small subset of how, when you think of the grand scheme of financing, it's a very small market compared to every other type of financing that's out there. And it just wasn't at the forefront of the regulators' minds. They weren't thinking about the fact that this is how renewables get financed. So I don't think that there is an intent to say that these types of investments are 4 times more risky than, say, traditional, stock equity investments, or that, mortgage should only be weighed at 50%. So these are exponentially riskier investments. I don't think that intent was there. I think that was just a consequence of the categories being so broad. And that's why I think it's been, the industry kind of jumped to getting in front of the regulators, getting in front of the government as quickly as possible to say, this is a huge unintended consequence of these broad categories. You've swept this type of investment into this category that's nothing like these other types of investments in this category. It's more akin to types of investments that are treated as less risky under the rules.
So what kind of category is it getting swept into? What else would we see weighted in terms of an investment like this at 400%? Because it's a huge number. So it's hard. And you're not the regulator. You did not put these rules out here. You're the one I'm talking to. So I guess you have to field the questions. But it seems like such a big number and such a big jump that it would be hard for that to be an accident.
Yeah, so it's non-publicly traded equity investments. So equity investments other than stock are what gets swept into this category. When you think about things like private equity that really are considered inherently risky, that's something that would be a non-publicly traded equity investment.
Okay. So what kind of conversations are you having right now? Are clients kind of calling you left and right as they're reading about this? Because I had someone else in the insurance industry send this to me. I had a developer send me your article as well. So I mean, it's getting around and people are talking about it because, like you said, if it manifests as a 400% weighted risk, then their livelihoods are in jeopardy. So everyone's kind of trying to round up the troops here. But I'm interested to hear kind of the rumblings you're getting too.
Yeah, I think, initially there was a lot of hand wringing. There was a lot of concern. People were putting out articles with titles like catastrophic
Or
and
dire.
dire. And, we were really concerned about the impacts. But I think as people have, groups have dug down, as there have been conversations have been had with the regulators, with the government, I think there's been a softening. I think the fear is subsiding. I think the industry is generally hoping that the final rules are going to have some kind of a fix, and this is not going to be something that's actually implemented. So I think people are moving kind of full steam ahead with near-term investments and just kind of a wait and see with the longer-term investments. But generally, banks aren't going to commit to capital investments more than a year or so in advance. So this is really outside the realm of a lot of the deals that are being done right now. And I think those that are doing deals that could be affected by this in the future are looking for some kind of a funding out or some kind of a change to the structure of the transaction if this were to be implemented in a way that made it uneconomic for the bank or impossible for the bank to do the deal.
So what are some of those workarounds then if it gets implemented or even if it doesn't? I mean, you hear about tax equity constraints all the time, so I'm assuming that developers and asset owners are attempting to get creative with these financing deals as often as possible. You mentioned transferability being one of those pathways, but can you map out a little bit of how that landscape looks in the IRA new world that we live in?
Yeah, so I think, there aren't a lot of commitments being signed for deals so far in the future that this would be applicable. But to the extent they are, I think tax equity is looking for some kind of a funding out or an agreement to restructure the transaction from the developer. That's probably a lot easier for a developer where they don't have lenders. If a lender's making a tax equity bridge loan, they're going to be very, very concerned that tax equity is actually going to make the investment to take out that portion of the loan. So I think it's going to be a negotiation as to, how is this handled? How can this be dealt with? Is it a complete walk away right? Or is it just, a flip to transferability so we all recover some of, the monetization? Or is it we have to have a good faith effort to go find a corporate to step into the terms of this agreement? I think all of those options are on the table. And I think the universe of deals that this affects is so small that there's no real one market answer. And I think it's all currently being negotiated between all the interested parties. But I think, it's one of those hope for the best, prepare for the worst scenarios, where before I think we were prepared for the worst, weren't sure we could hope for the best. I think that has kind of softened a bit. And now everyone's really hoping for the best. They think that we're going to get the best, but still looking to protect themselves from the worst.
That's helpful context. So, assuming that the worst doesn't happen and that the messages from law firms like yours and others are effective with regulators over the next, year or so, what's your general outlook for this market? Does it remain robust? Does it rise to the occasion given the demand fueled by the IRA? Again, noting that the people I talked to would cast a little bit of a darker cloud on the situation than I think was how you characterized it. But what's your general feeling for the next few years, as we know that both of these sides have to really be aligned in order to meet the potential of this legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that big banks are going to continue to do tax equity, assuming best case scenario. Some of the corporates may continue to do tax equity. I think we're going to see a lot of transferability. I think we're going to see, especially the corporates coming out and wanting to buy tax credits. They don't want to be stuck in an operating partnership. Frankly, developers a lot of the times don't want to be stuck in an operating partnership with an investor. So I think, the gold standard for most tax equity is going to be tax equity with that transferability option. If they realize they don't have the tax capacity they thought they did, they can just sell the tax credits. I think some of the newer technologies, especially some of these, much bigger deals, hydrogen, things like that, looking to monetize billions of tax credits, I think that's going to be difficult to find tax equity for. I mean, there aren't tax equity investors doing single $1 billion deals, financing one project with that many tax credits. They like to see a bigger portfolio. They like to, manage their risk by having multiple different technology investments. So if you're looking at financing one project with, $3 billion of tax credits, that's going to be outside the reach of traditional tax equity. So I think on both ends of the market, the much bigger end and the smaller end, that's where you're going to see tax equity being less useful and stepping in less. And that's where you're going to see other monetization strategies like transferability.
So is that the pathway for green hydrogen and other projects like that? I want to piece that out just because you are well aware that the hype around hydrogen has never been higher. It does have its share of doubters and skeptics that think that we're subsidizing fossil fuel interests or locking in carbon emissions with blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, whatever it is. Is there a clear financing pathway for those projects to even get off the ground in the first place? Is transferability that option?
I think for something like that, you may see an all of the above because, if you have an electrolyzer that's directly connected to, say, solar or wind, you may see tax equity financing of the solar and wind of the power generation, then see some other type of financing for the actual hydrogen production. Tax equity may not be willing to take those technology risks. They may not be willing, to cut a check of that size, but they may want to get involved in the project by financing the power generation, which is something that they've traditionally been comfortable with. So I think we'll see some of those, all of the above strategies for financing those types of projects. We'll see debt, we'll see equity, we'll see tax equity, direct pay certainly is a big part of hydrogen, and then transferability after the direct, for the tail after the direct pay period. So, I think it's not going to be one. I think, each project is going to have to be creative and seek out different methods of financing for the different pieces. But I do think I see a tax equity role in at least the power generation aspect of some of those projects.
What advice would you give to the developers who are listening now, who are navigating the tax equity markets right now and are maybe experiencing a tougher time than others, especially on the smaller scale? I think that's where it's been pretty acute. Is platforms with less prominence and smaller portfolios and ones that aren't backed by big PE firms. Any kind of tips that you would give them to get through this tricky economic stretch that we're in?
Yeah, I would say see if you can make your deal economic with transferability. If you can, then tax equity is only going to be accretive. But if you can make your economics by selling the tax credits, that's, a much less of an administrative burden. It can decrease the transaction costs. So there may be some benefits, even if you're not getting, $1.13, $1.14 on the dollar and only getting, 90 cents on the dollar. It may be worth it for the trade-offs. So I think the transferability option is a good one to explore. And the idea of this hybrid where you find a tax equity investor who doesn't necessarily have the tax capacity but is willing to sell the tax credits. That's especially helpful in, an ITC context because you can get a basis step up, more tax credits to sell.
Are you anticipating a good supply of partners wanting to engage in that transferability relationship?
The market's just blown up. I think probably, the biggest percentage of what I'm doing right now is transferability.
Oh, really?
It seems everybody wants in on it from, developers, corporates, insurance companies seem to really want to be buying tax credits. And I think the appetite for purchasing is only going to go up as we close the tax year and, tax liability is more known. I mean, when you've got to cut a check to the government and you're faced with paying $1 of tax or, 92 cents, 95 cents for tax credits, if you've got a big check to write, that's going to be, significant savings to your company if you can do that.
So I'm going to open up the floor to you. Obviously, we're talking about something on the horizon that people need to watch out for. What else is looming that we should keep our eyes open for? Is there another one of these, proposed rulings that is just waiting in the wings to pop out?
Well, I think, we're waiting on Treasury guidance on a number of things. I think domestic content largely missed the mark. It's under the current guidance, it's very, very hard to finance a domestic content bonus. It's just not really been workable for the industry. So I think, everyone's looking forward to seeing that fixed. So I think there's optimism there. There are a lot of other sets of guidance that everyone's waiting for from Treasury under the IRA that I think will be hopefully good for the industry. Markets are moving forward, tax equity is getting done, transferability is getting done, but there are some kind of choke points in the market that really are waiting on this guidance. So I think, as it gets released, every time we see guidance released, we see a huge flurry of activity to get more deals done. So I think as Treasury puts that out, we'll see the market explode more.
Yeah, and we've done a couple of episodes now on the waiting game for guidance from Treasury on green hydrogen applicability with the tax credits and all of that, and spoke to the CEO of Plug Power, as well as Jesse Jenkins from Princeton University, obviously on both sides of the spectrum there on where they hope the Treasury Department lands on, what qualifies. Why is that taking so long? Why are some of these issues hanging up longer than others?
Yeah, I've heard with hydrogen, it's actually a substantive question, that there's been some struggle within the government around the three pillars, around the time matching, the additionality, and the regionality, and where the government wants to come out on those three things. So, I keep hearing, it's imminent. We're going to get this guidance in now October.
I've been hearing that
we're
for
going to
6
get this
months.
guidance. Yeah. We're going to get this guidance in Q4. I mean, originally I was saying, it'll definitely be October, but now here we are October, and I'm hearing whisperings, well, Q4 maybe. So, but everyone,
I even
every
heard
grid
early next year was how it was described to me. So, I mean, and who knows? And really, like, I think that the shame here is that implementing this legislation has been so arduous that you're losing time, which is kind of the game right now, is how much can we get built quickly to take advantage of all this.
And a lot of grid connected projects just don't know if they're going to qualify for tax credits based on where the government comes out on some of those questions. So, if you have a grid connected hydrogen project, I think you have more questions than answers.
Well, and lucky for most players in this country, you probably don't. So I would say that at least you've got that working for you, that the industry is so young that we haven't gotten to that point for most. But Hilary Lefko, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was great talking with you too.
Thanks again to Hilary Lefko for joining the podcast. Factor This is a production of Renewable Energy World and Clarion Energy. Join us every Monday as we break down solar's biggest stories with industry leaders who actually move the needle. And please leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Factor This from Renewable Energy World.